You are not broke. You are undisciplined. Say it back to yourself. You are not broke. You are undisciplined. Two completely different diseases, and you've spent your whole life treating the wrong one. Stop blaming the paycheck. I don't care how small it is. I don't care what your rent costs or what gas prices did last month. None of that is the actual problem. And deep down, some part of you already knows it. The actual problem is sitting in your spending right now, today, and it has nothing to do with how much is coming in. I've watched this for 40 years. Man after man, woman after woman, swearing the raise would fix it, the promotion would fix it, the new job would fix it. It never fixes it, not once. Not one single time have I watched more money alone solve what was actually a discipline problem wearing a money costume. Here's what I know. Broke is a snapshot. Undisciplined is the camera that took it. And if you never fix the camera, you can change the scenery all you want. You are going to keep getting the same picture. Stay with me, because I'm about to prove it to you, and I don't think you're going to enjoy the proof. Let me ask you something plain. Think about the last time you got a little extra. A bonus, a tax refund, a raise you'd been chasing for a year. Be honest with yourself about what actually happened to it. For a great many people, the honest answer is that it disappeared, quietly, into the same general fog that swallows every other dollar, and 6 months later they could not tell you, with any real precision, where it went. Here is what I want you to notice about that pattern. It was not that the extra money was too small to matter. It was not bad luck. Something specific happened to that money. The same specific thing that happens to every dollar that passes through a particular kind of hands. And until that specific thing gets named and corrected, more money is not going to fix it. More money is just going to make the same leak faster. I want you to hold on to that word. Faster. Not different. Faster. That's the part that fools people. Because a bigger income really does feel like progress for a while, right up until the moment it settles into exactly the same shape the smaller income always took. Think about a bucket for a minute, because there's an old truth here worth sitting with. A bucket with a hole in the bottom does not fill up slowly. It does not fill up at all. It does not matter how big the hose is. It does not matter how hard the water's coming. Pour faster, and the bucket simply empties faster too, right alongside the pouring. And a man standing there watching the water level never quite reasons his way to the actual problem, because from where he's standing, it sure looks like the issue is that he doesn't have enough water pressure. He goes and gets a bigger hose, still empty. He goes and gets 2 hoses running at once, still empty, just now with twice the mess to clean up around his feet. The hole was never about the water. The hole was the whole problem, and every improvement to the water supply, without fixing that hole, was never going to produce anything except a faster-moving, equally empty bucket. Money behaves exactly like that water. Income is the hose. Discipline is whether the bucket actually holds anything. And I have watched more men chase a bigger hose their entire working lives, never once checking the bottom of their own bucket, than I could ever properly count. I want to press this a little further, because there's a detail in it people miss. A man standing over a leaking bucket, watching it stay empty, no matter how much water he pours, does not usually conclude the bucket is the problem. He concludes he simply hasn't found the right hose yet. He tries a different job, a second job on the weekends, a new hose, and then another, each one promising to finally be the one that fills the bucket. None of them ever will, not because the hoses were wrong, but because nobody's checked underneath the bucket yet. I want you to hold that picture, because we are going to come back to it more than once tonight. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Dominic. Dominic was 31 years old, working as a warehouse shift supervisor, earning what most people in his town would consider a respectable wage. He told me, the first time we sat down, that his whole financial problem came down to one thing. He simply did not make enough money. Get him a better job, a bigger paycheck, and everything else would sort itself out. I want you to hear how he described his own spending, because it matters. He did not describe himself as reckless. He described himself as a guy who worked hard and deserved a little something for it. Dinner out most Fridays, because he'd earned it. A new phone the day the old one felt slow, because why suffer with slow? Little things, constantly, each one perfectly defensible on its own. None of them ever written down anywhere. None of them ever added up against what was actually coming in. I asked him, that first conversation, whether he had any idea what he actually spent in an average month. He laughed a little and admitted he didn't, not really, though he was fairly confident it wasn't much. I want you to notice that word. Confident. Confident, with no evidence behind it whatsoever, which is a particular kind of confidence that costs people more than almost any other habit I've studied. Here's what happened next, and I want you to pay close attention to the timeline, because it's the whole point. 18 months after that first conversation, Dominic got the raise he'd been telling me would fix everything. A genuine promotion. Nearly 40% more income, overnight. I want to leave him right there, standing in his supervisor's office with the news of that raise still fresh, because what happened over the following year? And what never happened to a second person I'll introduce you to shortly, who started with considerably less than Dominic ever had, is the entire content of what I'm here to give you tonight. I'll come back to Dominic. Here's the mechanism, and once you see it, you'll recognize it everywhere. A raise does not change a man's relationship to money. It only changes the volume of money passing through whatever relationship he already had. If that relationship was disciplined, tracked, directed, held to a plan, more income means more gets built. If that relationship was undisciplined, spent reflexively, untracked, absorbed instantly into whatever felt good that particular week, more income simply means more gets absorbed at exactly the same rate, just with bigger numbers attached to it. This is why the raise does not fix anything on its own. The hole in the bucket did not care how big the hose got. It just let more water through, faster, and the man standing there watching, feeling briefly richer, has no idea yet that he is about to be exactly as broke as before, just on a larger and more embarrassing scale. I want to name something else here, because it matters to what follows. The bigger the hose, the more convincing the illusion becomes, at least for a while. A small income leaking away is uncomfortable but survivable. A large income leaking away, at the same undisciplined rate, produces bigger debts, bigger obligations, and a much steeper fall once the truth finally catches up. This is precisely why Dominic's story is not a small story about a warehouse supervisor. It is the exact same story that plays out at every income level I have ever watched, right up through incomes most people would consider genuinely wealthy. Here's the single most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight, and everything else is just decoration around it. Broke is not a number. Broke is a habit that happens to be visible in a number. You can change the number completely, double it, triple it, and if the habit underneath it never changes, the number will simply find its way back down to wherever the habit was always going to put it, given enough time. Discipline is not something you add once you have enough money to afford it. Discipline is the actual mechanism by which any amount of money, large or small, gets converted into something that lasts instead of something that leaks away. Read that back to yourself. You have been waiting for enough money to finally justify getting disciplined. It runs backwards. The discipline is what makes any amount of money finally worth having. Sit with that for a second. Don't rush past it. Think about your own bucket, right now, today, and ask yourself honestly whether the problem has ever actually been the size of the hose. Now consider the other side of this, because a principle like this one only becomes real once you've watched someone live it the opposite way and seen exactly what it produces. I knew a woman named Yvonne who worked as a receptionist at a small dental practice, earning meaningfully less than Dominic did even before his raise. By any measure of raw income, Yvonne had less to work with than Dominic had at any point in his story. But Yvonne did something specific, from nearly her very first paycheck, that Dominic never once did across his entire working life up to that point. She wrote every dollar down, not roughly. Every dollar, every week, in a plain notebook she kept in her kitchen drawer. And every Sunday evening she sat with that notebook for 15 minutes and looked, honestly, at where the money had actually gone that week versus where she'd meant for it to go. She told me the first several months of doing this were uncomfortable in a specific way. Not because the numbers were shocking, but because she kept catching herself, in writing, doing exactly the kind of small, defensible, unexamined spending that Dominic did constantly without ever once noticing. I asked her what had actually pushed her to start the notebook in the first place, since nothing dramatic had happened to prompt it. She told me it was something almost embarrassingly small. She'd overheard a coworker mention, offhand, that she genuinely didn't know how much she spent on coffee in an average month, and it could be anywhere from $30 to $300 for all she knew. Yvonne realized, hearing that she couldn't have answered the question about her own coffee spending either, and something about not knowing bothered her enough to start writing it down that same week. I want to give you the specific detail that mattered most, because it's the whole difference between her story and his. Yvonne set one simple rule for herself. Any spending outside her planned categories had to wait 24 hours before she acted on it. Not forbidden, just delayed. A day to actually think about whether she wanted it, or whether she just wanted the version of herself that felt good buying it in that particular moment. She told me the rule caught her more often than she expected. Most of the time, the 24 hours would pass, and the urge would simply be gone, replaced by mild relief that she hadn't acted on it. Every so often, the urge held, and she'd buy the thing anyway, but by then it was a decision rather than a reflex, and she never once regretted a purchase that had actually survived that single day of waiting. That one rule, held consistently, changed almost everything about her relationship to money within about a year. Not because her income had grown, it hadn't, meaningfully, but her bucket had stopped leaking, and every dollar that came in through that same modest hose started actually staying where she put it. I want to give you the specific numbers, because they matter more than the general description. At the 12-month mark, Yvonne had built a small emergency fund covering nearly 3 months of her basic expenses, entirely from a receptionist's wage, without a single raise or promotion during that entire year. She told me she'd run the arithmetic herself, out of disbelief, comparing what she'd actually saved against what she used to assume was simply impossible on her income. The number that had felt impossible turned out to be almost entirely a matter of where the leaks had been, not how much water was coming through the hose in the first place. She told me something else that stuck with me. She said the notebook hadn't made her feel restricted, the way she'd worried it might going in. It had made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like she actually knew what was happening to her own money, instead of finding out, after the fact, by watching the account balance drop and trying to reconstruct where it had gone. That specific feeling, she said, was worth more to her than the dollar figure itself, though the dollar figure was genuinely there too, sitting in an account that had never held that much before. Let's talk about why this is so hard to hear, because I don't want you thinking the people running this pattern are foolish. They're not. The ego does not like being told the problem was never external. It is far more comfortable, in the moment, to believe the hose is too small than to sit with the much harder truth that the bucket itself has a hole nobody's bothered to look at. Blaming the income lets a man off the hook entirely. Checking the bucket requires him to look, honestly, at choices he's made 100 times without thinking twice about any single one of them. I want to say something here that I think matters more than it first appears to. Blaming the hose is not stupidity. It's a genuinely comfortable story, because it puts the fix somewhere outside your own daily choices. If the problem is the income, the solution is a better job, a promotion, a different employer. All things that feel, in the moment, considerably more dignified to work toward than sitting down with a notebook and admitting you've been spending carelessly for years. Here's something else worth naming. Most of Dominic's individual purchases really were small, really were, on their own, entirely defensible. That's precisely what made the pattern so hard for him to see. Nobody ever confronted him about any single decision, because no single decision looked like a problem. It was only the accumulated pattern, viewed honestly all at once, that revealed the whole. And almost nobody ever views their own spending that way, because doing so requires exactly the kind of quiet, deliberate self-examination most people spend their whole lives structuring their schedules to avoid. I want to talk now about what actually happened once Dominic's raise hit his account. The first few months, he told me, felt genuinely great. More room on the credit card. A nicer place, because he could finally afford the deposit. A vehicle, because his old one had been fine, but this one was better, and better felt like something he'd finally earned the right to. I want you to notice the language there. Earned the right to. That phrase came up more than once when Dominic described his own spending, and I think it's worth sitting with, because it reveals something important. The raise had not simply given him more money. It had given him a story he could tell himself about why the spending was justified this time, in a way it hadn't quite been justified before. The story felt true. It was, in every practical sense, exactly the same story he'd been telling himself all along, just wearing a slightly more respectable outfit. By month 9, the extra income was fully absorbed. Not into anything specific he could point to with pride. Just absorbed, the exact same way his old income always had been, just at a larger scale, with larger and more consequential debts attached to the larger and more consequential things he'd acquired along the way. By the end of that year, Dominic was, by his own honest accounting, in a worse financial position than he'd been in before the raise arrived, carrying payments on a vehicle and an apartment that his old income never would have qualified him for, funded entirely by an income that had proven, conclusively, to be exactly as leaky as the smaller one before it. I asked him, near the end of that year, whether he still believed the problem had been the size of his paycheck. He was quiet for a while before answering. He told me, honestly, that he'd started to suspect it had never really been about the paycheck at all. I want to give you a fuller picture of what those 9 months actually looked like from the inside, because the summary alone doesn't capture how normal every single decision felt while he was making it. He upgraded his phone plan the week the raise hit, because he finally could. He signed a lease on a 2-bedroom instead of staying in his 1-bedroom, because 2 bedrooms meant he could finally have people over properly. He bought a truck he'd been eyeing for 2 years, telling himself the old one had been running rough anyway, which was true, though the old one was also entirely paid off and the new one wasn't. None of these were reckless decisions in isolation. A phone upgrade is not a scandal. A bigger apartment is not a scandal. A newer vehicle, on its own, is not a scandal. That's exactly the trap. Each decision, judged by itself, looked like a man finally enjoying the fruits of hard work. It was only the accumulated weight of all of them together, stacked month after month with no plan connecting any of them, that turned a 40% raise into a worse financial position than the one it was supposed to fix. He told me something else, later, that I think is worth repeating exactly. He said the strangest part wasn't losing the money. It was how little he could remember about where any specific dollar had actually gone. Not because he'd hidden anything from himself on purpose, because none of it had ever been written down anywhere, and an unwritten dollar, spent and forgotten, might as well never have existed at all, for all the good it did him afterward. Here's the practice for actually fixing this, because I've never believed understanding a principle without a method changes anything. First, write down every dollar for 30 days straight without judging any of it yet. Yvonne's notebook. A phone app if that's easier. The tool doesn't matter. What matters is seeing the actual pattern in writing, because almost nobody has ever done this honestly, and almost everybody is surprised by at least one thing it reveals. Don't try to change your spending during those 30 days. Just record it. The moment people start judging their own numbers mid-collection, they start quietly editing their behavior to look better on paper, which defeats the entire purpose. You need the honest, unedited version first, the same way a doctor needs an honest blood pressure reading before deciding on treatment. Second, set one 24-hour rule for any spending outside your planned categories. Not a ban. A delay. Give yourself a single day to decide whether you actually want the thing or whether you just wanted the momentary feeling of buying it. Write the rule down somewhere you'll actually see it. A note on your card. A reminder in your phone. The rule works because it interrupts the reflex, but only if you actually remember it exists in the exact moment the reflex fires. Third, review the week, every week, at a fixed time, for no more than 15 minutes. Yvonne chose Sunday evening. The specific day matters less than the consistency of returning to it, honestly, week after week, rather than only checking in during a crisis. Fourth, before any raise, bonus, or windfall arrives, decide in advance, in writing, exactly what portion of it is protected before it ever touches your regular spending. Dominic's raise had no destination waiting for it. It simply flowed into the same undirected current everything else flowed into. A decision made in advance, before the money exists, is worth infinitely more than a decision you're hoping to make honestly once the money's already sitting there, tempting you. I want you to think about why this order matters so much. A decision made in advance is made by the version of you that's thinking clearly, without any money yet in hand to cloud the judgment. A decision made after the windfall arrives is made by a version of you that's already excited, already picturing what the money could buy, and that version makes a considerably worse decision maker than the calm version deciding weeks ahead of time. Fifth, track not the total you saved, but the number of weeks you held the plan without breaking it. Discipline is a streak before it's ever a dollar amount. Protect the streak, and the dollar amount takes care of itself over time. A broken streak isn't a disaster, by the way. It's information. If you break the 24-hour rule 3 weeks running, that's not proof the whole system failed. That's a signal telling you exactly where your particular leak is strongest, which is worth knowing far more than it's worth beating yourself up over. A few objections, and I want to answer them straight. First, what about people whose income genuinely isn't enough, no matter how carefully it's managed? Isn't it unfair to tell someone in real financial hardship that discipline alone will fix it? I want to answer this honestly rather than dismiss it. There absolutely are circumstances where income genuinely falls short of basic needs, and I am not standing here tonight telling you discipline alone erases genuine hardship. What I am telling you is that discipline determines what happens to every dollar you do have, regardless of how many or how few there are, and in nearly every case I've watched closely, the undisciplined bucket leaks at every income level, right up through incomes most people would consider genuinely comfortable. Fixing the leak doesn't solve every problem, but it solves the specific problem that more income, on its own, has never once solved for anybody. I want to be precise here, because I don't want this point stretched further than it should go. If you're genuinely working full-time and still can't cover basic needs, that's a real and serious circumstance deserving real attention, not a lecture about discipline. What I'm speaking to tonight is the far more common situation, which is a person earning enough to genuinely get ahead, who never does, because the leak was never found and named. Second, isn't tracking every dollar exhausting? Doesn't real financial freedom mean not having to think about money constantly? I understand the appeal of that idea, but I want to push back on it directly. The tracking is not the permanent condition. It's the diagnostic phase. Yvonne did not track every dollar for the rest of her life with the same intensity as those first several months. She tracked closely enough, for long enough, to actually see the leak and patch it. Once the habit changed, the tracking became lighter. Because the mind had already absorbed the discipline, the notebook was originally there to teach it. Think of it the way you'd think of learning to drive. You watch the road with total, exhausting attention the first few weeks. Nobody drives that way forever. The attention becomes automatic, folded into habit, and eventually you're driving safely without consciously narrating every single motion. The notebook works the same way, intense at first, automatic later. Third, and I regard this one as serious. What if I've tried budgeting before, and it never stuck? Most budgets fail for a specific reason, and it's worth naming plainly. They try to change everything at once, and they rely on willpower alone to hold the line, with no actual delay mechanism built in for the moment temptation shows up. The 24-hour rule exists precisely to solve this. It doesn't ask you to never want something. It only asks you to wait a day, which is a considerably easier thing to actually sustain than a permanent, white-knuckled denial of every impulse the moment it arrives. I've watched a great many failed budgets up close, and nearly all of them share the same fatal flaw. They're built around restriction rather than information. A person decides, in a burst of resolve, to simply spend less across every category simultaneously, without ever actually identifying where the specific leak was located. That kind of budget collapses within weeks, almost always, because it's fighting a war on every front at once instead of finding the one or two leaks actually doing the damage and patching those specifically. Yvonne's notebook wasn't a restriction. It was a map. Maps don't require willpower to read. They just require you to actually look at them. Fourth, doesn't a person eventually need more income, regardless of discipline, to reach real financial goals? Yes, eventually. For larger goals, income matters. I'm not telling you income is irrelevant forever. What I'm telling you is that income arriving into an undisciplined bucket produces the exact same emptiness Dominic experienced, regardless of how large it eventually gets. Fix the bucket first, grow the hose second. Reverse that order, and you're simply guaranteed to repeat Dominic's exact mistake, just with bigger numbers attached to the repetition. I want to leave you with one further thought on this particular objection, because I think it matters more than the others. The people who eventually do build real, lasting wealth are, almost without exception, the people who fixed the bucket first and grew the hose second, in that specific order. I have never once watched the reverse work out well for anybody, at any income level, in any trade. The order is not a suggestion. It is the entire mechanism by which growing income actually turns into something that lasts. I want to tell you about one more person, because I think her story sharpens everything into a single point. Her name was Delphine, and she was 63 years old when I met her. Recently widowed, managing, for the first time in her adult life, an entire household budget alone after decades of her late husband handling every financial decision between them. She told me she felt, in those first months, completely unequipped, convinced that whatever savings existed would simply run out because she'd never learned to manage money the way he had. I want you to sit with that fear for a moment, because I think it's more common than people admit. Delphine wasn't undisciplined in any obvious sense. She simply had never once needed to be, because someone else had always held the notebook, so to speak, and she genuinely believed the skill itself was something she'd missed her chance to learn. She started, almost by accident, doing something close to what Yvonne had done years earlier, writing every expense down, because she genuinely didn't know where anything was going and needed, badly, to understand it. Within 4 months, she'd found several recurring expenses neither she nor her husband had actually needed for years. Subscriptions, memberships, small automatic charges that had simply continued, unexamined, because nobody had ever looked closely enough to question them. She told me one of those recurring charges had been running, quietly, for over 11 years, for a service neither of them had used more than twice. 11 years. She did the arithmetic on that one alone and sat with the number for a long time before telling anyone about it. I asked her what that discovery actually felt like, because I think the emotional texture of it matters as much as the arithmetic. She said her first reaction was anger, briefly, at her late husband, for letting something like that run unnoticed for over a decade. But she told me that anger didn't last long, because she realized, sitting with the notebook, that she'd had just as much opportunity to notice it as he had, across all those years, and never once looked either. The charge wasn't really his failure, or her failure specifically. It was the failure of nobody in the household ever once checking the bucket, together or separately, for over a decade. She told me, a year later, that the actual amount of money she'd freed up was smaller than she'd expected. What surprised her more was the specific confidence that came from finally understanding, in detail, exactly where every dollar was going. She said it was the first time in her entire adult life she'd felt genuinely in control of her own finances, and it had nothing to do with the size of her income, which hadn't changed at all. It had everything to do with finally checking the bucket for holes instead of assuming, the way she'd always assumed, that money management was simply a skill she didn't have. I want to add one final detail about Delphine, because I think it closes her story properly. Roughly 18 months after she started that notebook, her sister, going through a difficult divorce, asked Delphine for advice on managing money alone for the first time. Delphine, who had considered herself completely unequipped for exactly this kind of question less than 2 years earlier, sat her sister down and taught her the same notebook system, the same 24-hour rule, start to finish, from memory, without hesitation. The woman who once believed the skill had passed her by had become, in under 2 years, someone teaching it to somebody else. I told you at the opening that you are not broke, you are undisciplined, and I promise to prove it before we finish tonight. Here's what I'm asking you to do before you sleep tonight, and I'm asking it exactly, without softening it. Take a single sheet of paper. Write down every dollar you spent this past week, as honestly and completely as you can remember it. Don't judge it yet. Just write it. Then look at it the way Yvonne looked at her own notebook every Sunday evening. Honestly, without excuse, asking specifically where the leak actually is. That single honest accounting is where every version of what I've described tonight actually begins. Not with more income, with one honest look at the bucket you already have. I want to leave you with one last thought before you go write that list. The bucket doesn't care how ashamed you feel looking at it. It doesn't care how many times you've tried this before and quit. It just sits there, honestly, showing you exactly where the water's been going, the same way it would show anybody, regardless of income, regardless of age, regardless of how long the leak's been running. The only thing that changes anything is finally looking. Dominic eventually did exactly this, nearly 2 years after that raise had come and gone without building him anything lasting. He told me, the last time we spoke, that the specific moment everything changed was not the raise. It was the evening he finally sat down and wrote out a full month of his own spending, honestly, for the first time in his adult life, and saw, in his own handwriting, exactly where the water had been going the whole time. You do not need a bigger hose. You need to check your bucket for holes, honestly, tonight, before you spend one more dollar, assuming the problem was ever the size of the income coming in. Thank you.